Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you. We'll read the Treaty 6 land acknowledgement. We are a part to Treaty 6, and as such, we wish to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many indigenous peoples. We recognize the diversity of First Nations who have, at one time, lived across the territory, as well as the presence of the Métis Nation. Thank you. Mr. Bouchard, do we have any public forum you are aware of?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will go to approval of the agenda. Do we have any additions to the agenda? Oh, any deletions? Okay. Do we have any deletions, audits? Okay, finance, we have the report attached, I see. Labor.
Mr. Chairman, just we don't have to go through those committee reports anymore now that we have submissions.
Submissions, okay. Thank you. Do we have any changes? Oh, all right. I will ask for the motion to approve the agenda. I see.
I can make a motion to approve the.
Agenda. Thank you. Go ahead.
I make a motion that the board approve the agenda as presented.
Thank you, Trustee Tagwood. All in favor? So, okay, since we are all virtually, okay. See, there are opposed. I see no hands up. Thank you. This is now passed. Minutes of the meeting. We'll look for the approval of the minutes. Any errors or omission found in the minutes? I see no hands. Okay. If I can now ask for the motion to accept the minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move that the board approve the minutes of the regular meeting held October 27th, 2021 as circulated.
Thank you, Trustee Miller. All in favor? Okay. Thank you. Any opposed? I see none. This is now carried. Attached is the board priorities. And this is for your information. We will soon be working on the board priorities and the goals for our coming year. Okay. We have action item number 1, Alberta Education Results Report, AERR, and I will defer that now to Mr. Bouchard to walk us through.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you have in your package a draft division annual education results report. So I know that the board has had this information and we've gone into some detail in a committee meeting, kind of highlighting some of the areas as well as discussing implications, conclusions and insights into the report. What I will say is the strategies in the report, they are directly out of the education plan in May. So at this time of year, we do not review the strategies, simply we touch on the results that are in that report. The division as a whole performed quite well. In some ways, a bit surprisingly, considering that COVID had a lot of implications over the last school year. We do know that dissatisfaction in some areas with parental involvement were a little higher than normal. And I think, again, that is a factor of COVID. But what I'd also like to highlight in this report is that the division is really lacking achievement results. And that's because for the last 2 years, we have not had provincial achievement tests or diploma exams. And many of the goals of the division are measured in the academic PAT and diploma results. So that is something to note, and that's why there's no data for those 2 areas. After this results report, it will be important for schools and the division as a whole to enter into a consultation mode between December 1st and May 30th when we release our education plan. So with that, I'll ask if any trustees have any questions specific to the report.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Bouchard? I see none. Okay. Then I would like to entertain the motion for these results. Okay. I see Trustee Taylor Sarwar's hands up. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I move that the board approve the 2021 Alberta Education Results Report, AERR, as presented.
Thank you. We are in favor. Okay. Any opposed? I see none. Okay. Thank you. This is now carried. We'll go to 4.2, transfer to reserves. I would like to defer that now to Mr. Latka, our Secretary Treasurer, to lead us in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regards to transfers to reserves, it's sort of the final step with regards to audited financial statements. The inclusion of the financial statements in these transfers of reserves has already been included. What we are dealing with here actually are sort of the normal transfers to reserves, so unspent funds at the school level where allocations have occurred. In terms of not only their government funding allocations being transferred to reserves, but also any school-raised funds, kind of as we've described them as school-generated funds being transferred to reserves. Beyond that, the board made provisions in the budget last year that $350,000 be utilized from the end of 2021 in the budget for 21-22. $300,000 was included in allocations to schools as part of their budget. A further $50,000 was designated to administrative costs at Father Lacombe. They are currently in a modernization and a capital project, and that requires additional administrative time, whether it be from the principal attending site meetings or administrative support as they go through the process of acquiring furniture and equipment for the new building. Both of those items were approved by the board in their budget. This would be the final step in recognition of that. The last is for the information of the board. Once those reserves are set up, there's also an inclusion in terms of description and when they're expected to be utilized. So a date for utilization is set so that they can be revisited. One of those items is a capital reserve for furniture equipment. That over the course of this year will need to be revisited because it is now an expired reserve designation. The other thing is that's presented for information is utilization. And there was a small utilization of approximately $9,000 of capital reserves for the administrative building that was used to upgrade some furniture and equipment here. That being said, just as a sidebar for the benefit of all the trustees, is that until last year, there was no specific funding for administration, and there continues to be no specific capital funding for administration. So the operation of the building, the board office has to be dealt with within the allocations and the funding of the province for that. So there was reserves set up previously to help support some of the larger maintenance items. A couple of years ago, we had our roof replaced, and there remains about $80,000 left in that fund. So there's background information on each of the funds, and I respectfully request a motion by the board to approve those transfers.
Thank you, Mr. Lapp. Any questions? What's in the background? Any question? Okay. I see no questions, no hands up. Okay. If I can now entertain a motion for this request. Thank you, Mr. Lena. Go ahead.
I would like to make the motion that the board approve the transfer of funds to operating and capital reserves for the year ending August 31st, 2021 as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Lena. Any question, comments, any discussion? Okay.
Great, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I have, I guess, a technical question. Is it common practice not to have an amount of that transfer in the motion?
The amounts are typically presented in different areas, and the operating reserves, because they're specified, and that's why the recommended motion says as presented, so that the various amounts are already there.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Because you have them in SGF, so many different areas. Thank you. All right. Any further discussion? I see none. Okay, we'll now call the question. All in favor? All right. Okay. Carried. Thank you. We will now move to 4.3. Opting out of the Alberta School Foundation Fund. You've all seen the background. Any question? Okay, I will ask for the motion, please. I will now ask for the motion, please.
Mr. Chair, I believe Trustee Sirois has raised her hand.
Oh, okay, I cannot, for some reason, I need to change my view here. Okay, Trustee Sirois, please go ahead.
I move that the board declare Division 4 of Part 6 of the recently amended Education Act 2012 16415 does not apply to this board.
Thank you. Any discussions? Okay. See none, see no hands up. I will now, okay, I see no hands up. I will now call for the question. All in favor? Okay. Thank you. It's passed, carried. Thank you, board. All right. So 4.41. The audited financial statements. Thank you again, and I will defer this to Trustee Miller and our Secretary Treasurer to lead us in this audited financial statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will gladly turn this over to our Secretary Treasurer, Mr. Latka.
Thank you both. With regard to our audited financial statements, we've got a brief presentation. I would also like to acknowledge the attendance of Camille Barube and Leon Pfeiffer. Camille is one of the board's public members with the audit committee. Unfortunately, Laura Niblet, who's the other public member, was unable to attend today's meeting because of a prior commitment. Leon Pfeiffer is the partner from RSM, our auditors, and both are here in support of the committee's work, as well as if there happens to be a technical question which the board has. I've prepared a presentation with regards to the audited financial statements. One of the key aspects, of course, is that the committee has reviewed the audited financial statements. Financial statements, the trustees have received in confidence until they have been authorized for release. They remain so as information to the board. The audited financial statements have received a clear audit opinion, which means that they are free from any material misstatements and misrepresentations in terms of the financial statements. And so what I'd like to do is, on behalf of the committee, touch upon some of the highlights from the financial statements. And if you will bear with me while I share my screen, I'll walk you through a brief presentation, or as brief as an accountant can make things. With regards to the audited financial statements for last year, certainly there was some significant events that impacted our financial circumstances. Most significant is that with COVID, our enrollments that we had projected for last year were significantly below the projections. The funding model for the province says that if our projections are higher than what our actual numbers are, the funding model says that there will be a recovery in the following year. So because of that significant drop in enrollment, and I'll talk a bit about what that looked like, there is $1.1 million of funding that was recognized and reduced in terms of financial statements for our presentation for 2021. Late last year, the province also announced that they would not be doing that recovery in 21-22. So that will help our financial picture as we move through this year, that funding was not recovered. Also of significance is we established an online K-12 school in a very, very short period of time, and saw it become our largest school essentially for the year. Over the course of the year, in terms of significant events, we also had $2 million of federal funding for the pandemic response. Certainly helped us with a number of costs that were uncertain and unanticipated, but also allowed us, as we moved through the COVID and the pandemic responses, to make sure we had resources available for students and staff. And then overall, just our operations during that response period, we had cycles of in-person and at-home learning, staff absenteeism, at times almost shortages. The additional provisions, of course, that our facilities department had for cleaning. And then overall, some limitations that we had in normal educational enhancements. Field trips were very limited, and certainly after school sports activities were also limited. So a number of those things impacted the financial statements and how we compare last year or the budget for last year to the actual outcome. Of course, the 1.1 million that I've talked about previously, key results, the one-time federal funding of $2 million. Not only was portions of that utilized, but it allowed it, because as we were preparing for this, we had made some assumptions in terms of the type of costs we would have to bear under our provincial budget. And so that federal funding helped support those costs as well. Overall, we have a net increase in our unrestricted net assets. That was a significant reversal from what we had anticipated to be a deficit year in terms of spending as well, spending not only any undesignated funds, but also reducing most of our school surpluses and savings from prior accumulated surpluses from prior years. And then the last thing that has been of particular importance in the board, and certainly that is presented in the media, is what is our administrative costs, and that are in our financial statements, our board expenditures are below the cap or the maximum that the board is allowed to spend. So those are the key results that administration has identified from our financial statements. One of the things that we found reviewing last year financially is that the federal funding of supportive costs created significant savings in budgeted expenditures. We had budgeted for centralized staff that got redesignated to other purposes, part and parcel to meet needs, part and parcel as they were resources that were available because we were unable to do certain other activities. So for example, the online principal was one of our directors who was sort of inadvertently reassigned to be the online principal for our school, was certainly key in the operation of the online school. In terms of our facility costs, we had a great deal of support. We were anticipating huge costs and a huge burden for custodial and supplies. Again, that federal funding allowed us to support a lot of those additional costs and supplies through that money. Again, finding that we had apportioned of our regular provincial funding, we could utilize federal funding for those purposes. Then also we had previously identified surpluses through restrictions in programming and COVID protocols. Again, those ones we had identified in the springtime as part of our budgeting so that we could carry and allocate those resources for schools this year already in advance of the financial statements, which is not typical for our past. Just with regards to some comparative data, when we talked about the reduction in student enrollments, here's what our enrollments looked like historically. Last year, we had budgeted for, assuming, even though we had just come out of a COVID lockdown, we were assuming that we would be able to do normal operations. So that means we'd provide services for about 4,400 students when we opened our budget. When we started off the school year, what we found is that we were down to about just over 4,000 students, which is the lowest point we had been in about 3 years. So where we had always been expecting some growth and anticipating the need for additional staff, as well as having additional resources presented, that did not come to fruition. With thanks to the province, because of their model, we knew we would have all the money this year. We'd have to be adjusting for the following year for any lack of funding. Further, the province rose and identified that that would not be appropriate given what was seen across the province. With regards to looking at the budget for last year as compared to our actuals, our revenues look surprisingly similar, even though we have recognized that there's $1.1 million being recovered by the province and accounting for that. What we also saw was that we had some overestimations with regards to revenues that was also reflected in our expenses, especially in facilities and maintenance. We had overestimated our revenues for supported buildings in terms of amortization expenses and those supports coming through as revenue. As well, we had overestimated our infrastructure maintenance renewal program in terms of our expenditures as well as our revenues, simply because we had looked at full expenditures of those revenues and not all those revenues were fully expended by the end of the year. So both of those items, plus that recovery of 1.1 million, when we look at our financial statements on a line-by-line basis, you'll notice that our Alberta Education grant funding is down by $2 million. That accounts for that $2 million drop from our projected revenues. When we look at our federal money, we'll notice a significant increase of about $2 million. And that's where our revenues overall are about the same as what they have been budgeted for. This was predominantly because of that federal support for our pandemic response and to the division. So that created a great deal of help financially. Sorry. With regards to expenditures, here's where we notice that we've had some savings. And it's not to say that any students went without or that we did not provide resources to schools as they needed them or rose to any requirements. There were in some cases some things that we just couldn't do. For example, our substitute costs, we had anticipated a lot of employee absenteeism as we went into isolation. But what we found was that it wasn't just staff that were isolated, it was the entire class. So our substitute costs were not as high. When we are looking at travel and PD costs, again, because we had gone working virtually, a lot of business restrictions in terms of, and also our operational restrictions, there was $200,000 that was saved. And it's, again, it's not because we didn't do things, we just weren't able to. And our budget was based on things being normal or traditional in terms of their operation. Supplies across the instructional area had cost savings of about $300,000. And then we had an unspent contingency fund as we were meeting needs of $200,000. So those were all in the instructional areas and accounts for nearly $1 million in expenses. O&M, when you're looking at the financial statements in line, I had already spoken to that there was about $1 million that we had overestimated in terms of revenues as well as costs. So there's no impact to that department per se because it's due to basically capital items, either amortization or IMR funding. But we also had a huge realization of cost savings in our insurance programs. Previously, we had escalations of our insurance, which led to the board making a decision to leave our previous insurance provider known as ASB and look at other providers. And that amounted to about $200,000 in insurance savings by changing carriers. Part of that is just our loss history in terms of our insurance profile and not being tied to all school boards under the ASB program with various groups at different levels of insurance history. The overall effect, of course, then is with regards to utilization of that federal money, we still were able to reserve or leave unspent about $900,000 of our provincial funding. So that added to our unrestricted net assets position. And again, looking at comparatives of where we had budgeted for at about 37 million, and we were down by about $36 million in instruction. That's where I talked about that $1 million. O&M, again, about $1.2 million in the difference in our estimate, and about $200,000 in our insurance savings. In the areas of transportation, we were pretty much on target, very little change for transportation. And we continued to support our contractors even when we were on lowered student transportation needs or in a full-on lockdown where transportation services were not required, but we, in a support of our contractors and for them, their ability to maintain staff, we continued payments to them. And with regards to system administration and governance, we came in, our budget was $2 million. We came in at slightly over $2 million, but our cap was well in excess of $2 million. About $2,070,000 is our cap in our expenditures. So we were below our cap overall. In terms of comparatives, again, looking at our unrestricted net assets and operating reserves, our unrestricted net assets has seen a sizable increase, again, because of the cost savings that we were able to realize by utilizing the federal funding that was available to us. We also, if you compare to the budget, we were planning that our school reserves would be somewhere around 152,000 by the end of the year. Our school and operating reserves when we finished the year was at $1.2 million. And again, the majority of that is at the school level. And another 350,000 will be utilized this year to support school budgets, as well as the administrative team at Father Lacombe. Certainly, it's the highest point that we've had in the last 3 years in terms of our reserves. Now, on this chart, there's a green dot. Hopefully, it's evident to everybody. What that green dot represents is the value that the province looks at in terms of what the board has available to it. And so they refer to that as an adjusted operating surplus. So what that includes is our undesignated funds, our operating reserves, but it does not include the school generated funds or capital reserves. So when the province is evaluating us and comparing us, they're looking at that accumulated operating reserves. And on the next slide, that becomes very important. The only other thing to note is that the board has had a target of 5 days of operations in their unrestricted surplus. Currently, that sits at $12.7 million. One of the things that we'll have to also look at is before, and certainly may be concerned to trustees and the board, is what does that $2.4 million mean for the jurisdiction in terms of putting supports in place of students and those items. Back in September, the board was advised that our enrollments were still overly optimistic. We were short by about 140 students across the division. We did a preliminary estimate at that point in time that would equate to a $1.4 million recovery for 22-23. So certainly going into budgeting processes for 22-23, we'll keep that in mind. And I want to make sure that the board and trustees keep that in mind when looking at that $2.4 million, is that if we want to make a more gradual adjustment to our operations, utilizing some of that unspent reserves will help in budgeting for next year. And then also looking at comparatives with regards to our accumulated operating surplus. The province every February issues a summary for the previous 5 years of how we compare to provincial average, as well as a cohort of similar sized boards on a number of financial measures. One of them that is probably the most political is the accumulated operating surplus. And so how we compare to our cohort is what I've tried to represent here. For the financial year 2020-2021, we don't have the cohort figure. So I've presented it with the budget. But when we look at our actual versus cohort in the previous 2 years, so for 2020 and 2019, we were significantly below our cohort. So similarly sized boards based on the number of students. Right now, we are comparable to our cohort group in 2019. But what I'm anticipating and what the minister has alluded to is that many, if not all, school boards are going to see this kind of escalation in their unspent funds and their accumulated operating surpluses. So again, for the board, it's to keep this information in mind in terms of their advocacy roles. And also to keep in mind where we have traditionally sat with regards to similarly sized boards, which we've been significantly less. We haven't previously kept a whole lot of money moving forward. So in my summary comments, again, when I looked at my presentation last year, I called 2019-2020 a difficult year. 2021 was difficult year 2.0. And but we did have some financial benefits similar to what we saw the previous year in terms of cost savings, and certainly with the added support from the federal government being fully appreciated by the division. But it also allowed us some flexibility and provided for some unspent resources. Again, keeping in mind that our current enrollments are lower than projected, and that the initial projection of $1.4 million recovery is what we'll be looking at moving forward as we start our budgeting processes for 22-23. So those are the highlights from the financial statements. There are a number of schedules and supporting documents within that, which were reviewed in detail with the audit committee. And so that is my report. And yes.
Thank you, Mr. Laka. Do I see? Perfect. You have any comments here? Oh, before I go that, yeah, welcome, Mr. Ruby, and welcome, Mr. Farva. Nice seeing you joining us to finish this work. Thank you. Any comments before we go to the next slide?
Mr. Chair, I see Trustee
Michael.
Leonard has his hand up.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
I just had a
Yeah,
question
go ahead,
about,
Mr. Leonard.
thank you. I just had a question about transportation. Part of our contract, would that include things like field trips and non-recurring trips in the contract, or are those things we pay out as they happen?
Those are contracted separately, and when we talk about student transportation, it is strictly the transportation to and from school.
Okay, thank
Not
you.
on field trips. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, then I see no hands. Mr. Laka, if we can continue with the audited financial statements then, please.
At this point, I'm looking, the committee made a recommendation, and perhaps Chair Miller would like to further that recommendation to the board.
So, sorry, just for clarification, am I moving this or recommending it to the board outside of the report?
I'm recommending it to the board.
You'd make the motion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I move that the Board of Trustees of the St. Thomas Aquinas Roman Catholic School Division receive the audited financial statements dated August 31st, 2021 as information, approving their release to the public and to Alberta Education.
Thank you, Committee Chair Miller. Any?
Mr. Chair, you've muted yourself.
My fingers won't stop. Any question, any discussion? Okay, so to give some context to this as well, we've made certain moves here again to support our financial situation, like the board moving to virtual meetings and to save costs, as well as how to do things differently in this COVID world. So all of that, and as you all know, and Mr. Lakadi touched on, we don't have enough in our reserves compared to, so when you hear those rhetoric in this to say, oh, school boards have money, you can categorically say, STAR don't. We are not sitting on any millions. So all of those give some context as to we are a small board and we manage, and like he did said, we are below our cap. Some boards are just close to their cap as well. So we do take our time as to when we are approving things and when we are looking at how do we save cost as we move along, so we are not too close to our cap. So if there are no comments, I will then call the question.
I think Camille has a question.
Oh yeah, sorry, Mr. Bobby, come on.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments that I would like to make from the public at large. This has been my second attendance of this process. And I think thanks are to be offered to the auditors for their assistance in the presentation that we got earlier last week. And also, I think the compliments should be offered to Mr. Latka and the administrative staff for the audit results that have been presented. We've got a good audit, and I think it's worth noting. And also compliments to all of you for looking after the operations through a very challenging year. So I thought I should add those before we wrap up that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Borobe, for those comments. And again, like you said, if the general public understands some of the work that is being done to be fiduciarily responsible for what we get from the provincial government, I'm sure that gives them a better idea as to how we are managing these responsibilities seriously with diligence. Thank you. Okay. All right. I will then call the question. All in favor? The recommendation? All right. Okay. Any opposed? None. Thank you so much. This is now carried. And again, I would like to extend my thanks to Mr. Borobe here, and we don't have Laura on here with us. She's one of our public member at large as well. And then for our auditor, Mr. Favor, for joining us again. And thank you very much. We so much appreciate the work that you do to support this board. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Latka. Mr. Latka,
Yes, sir.
would you like Mr. Fiver and Mr. Borobe to continue join us, or they are free to go?
They are free to go.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, right. So we'll continue with, I'm thinking, do we take a natural 5 here and come back at 20 after 11, please? Okay, let's take 5 and come back 20 after 11, please. Thank you.